Well, I think we'll get started. Thank you very much for coming tonight, for finding the right room. It's not always easy for me, in fact, to remember where the gallery theater is in the ELC. So a number of students asked me tonight in advance, and I had to rack my brain to remember exactly where the room was. So good to see everyone. This is the fourth, Chris Ellis, fourth event in our campus politics and the liberal arts series that is being sponsored this year by the Bucknell Program for American Leadership and Citizenship. So we have two more talks to come in this series, both of which will take place in the spring semester. We encourage folks to take a look, if you haven't already, take a look at the website for our group, which is at, I always get this wrong, so I'm going to depend on a couple of people in the audience to correct me if I do it again. I believe the URL is bpalc.blogs.bucknell.edu. It's way too complicated, but it is what it is. And so if you're able to follow those directions, again, bpalc.blogs, in the plural, .bucknell.edu. You'll find a lot of other links for the various series, and both this year and in previous years that we've run. All the previous talks for all the series that we've run have video links to those talks up on the blog. So a wealth of information for you should you wish to consult it there. And also you'll see the talks that are coming up next semester. Again, in this series, I messed this up the last time, Chris Ellis, so you're going to help me out on this. Peter Bogosian is next. He doesn't even know. So at some point in the first couple of months of the spring semester, we've got Peter Bogosian coming out to talk about some of the research that he and some of his colleagues have done on what they termed grievance studies in academia. That's some really fun and interesting and scandalous material, and he's a great speaker and a great academic voice on this phenomenon. So I encourage you, if you're interested in that stuff, to come and hear him. And then we've got Laura Kipnis coming from Northwestern University to talk specifically about some of her research and her adventures with Title IX on campuses, both on her own campus and more generally in some other campuses around the country. We also have in the spring semester some more events that are coming up in the second series that BPLC has organized this year. This is a series that's titled Questioning American Identities. We had the kickoff talk in that series this past October. Alan Gelzo, the Princeton historian, was out to talk to us about Lincoln at Gettysburg, and we have a number of other talks lined up in the spring series. I'm not going to try to go through that whole list, but again, they're all up on the BPLC website, and I encourage you to have a look at that stuff. I think you might find some of it interesting. Tonight's speaker is Professor Jason Manning, who is an associate professor at West Virginia University. And he's here to talk to us a little bit about the fascinating research that he and a colleague of his did. And this is research that I take it Professor Manning is still engaged in and still ongoing. They published the results of it in a book just published last year, I believe 2018, is that right? The title of the book is The Rise of Victimhood Culture. In that book, what Professor Manning and his colleague, Professor Campbell is your co-author, what they tried to do in the book is to show how some of the things that are going on regarding cultural conflict and debate on college campuses are in fact linked to larger phenomena in the entirety of American society and American culture. So Professor Manning is a sociologist who's spent a lot of time focusing on those kinds of questions and issues in the broader American culture. And so he's going to give us a relatively brief introduction to some of the main themes of that book and that research. And then we're going to have a little bit of a back and forth between the two of us afterwards, based on some questions that I have developed from my reading of the book. And then we will very quickly turn it over to the audience to see if you folks would like to join in the conversation. So without any further ado, again, thanks very much again for coming, and please help me to welcome Professor Manning.
Okay. Actually, this subject is a little bit of a sideline for me. Most of my published work prior to this book is on suicide, and specifically on human conflict as a cause of suicide. And my co-author, Bradley Campbell, most of his work was on genocide, and genocide as a way of handling ethnic conflict. So we're rooted in this area of sociology, the study of conflict. So before we get into the meat of this thing, I should probably stop and explain exactly what that means. By conflict, we mean something that occurs whenever someone has a grievance, whenever someone defines another person's behavior as wrong or objectionable or in some way deviant. And this is a very broad category. This could be things as minor as finding someone rude or annoying, and as things as major as serious crimes or the great evils of history. And conflict, in this sense, is something that happens every day in every human relationship. We have conflicts in our face-to-face relations. You might get mad at a roommate for not doing his share of the cleaning and think that's unjust, or maybe mad at a boyfriend or girlfriend or spouse for not making enough alone time with you. We also have grievances against people we don't know personally, people we see in the media. I watch the presidential debates and get mad about what they say or what they don't say. We sometimes have collective conflict. We get mad at whole social categories, those damned, Christians, Muslims, Democrats, Republicans, insert your group there. Or conflict between organizations and individuals, like if Walmart decides to file a lawsuit against me or the government decides to prosecute me for a crime. And so in the sociology of conflict, one of the questions we ask is, what sort of grievances do people tend to have? That is, what do they complain about? What do they condemn? What do they punish? And if you think about this, this varies quite a bit. And most obviously, it varies across different countries and across different historical periods. And sometimes in places, drinking alcohol is a crime. Other times in places, it's not. And sometimes in places, you could be executed for changing your religion. And other times in places, no. In addition to these differences in exactly what people think is rude or criminal or deviant, you get differences in how they rank various offenses, like exactly how offensive they think something is. In one society, adultery might be a relatively minor character flaw, causes some arguments, but everyone kind of expects it to happen now and again. In another society, it's something someone gets killed over or gets you socially ostracized. So there's variation in the severity of deviance. In addition to this variation in what people have grievances about, what they have conflicts about, there's variation in exactly what they do when they have a grievance. People, someone offends me. What do? Do I punch him in the face? Do I call the police? Do I just sit down and talk to him? Or do I gossip behind his back? Or all these different ways we have of handling conflict with one another: avoidance, aggression, appeals to third parties and formal legal authorities. In the typical day, a person probably uses many different ways of handling conflict. So what sort of response do people have when they have a grievance? And here again, this varies, and it varies most obviously if you think of like broad cultural variation. In some cultures or subcultures, it's much more common to handle conflicts with violence than it is in other cultures or subcultures. And vice versa, you can have cultures or subcultures where it's very common to handle problems with avoidance, give people the cold shoulder, shun them, go separate ways, or negotiation, or compromise, or calls to the police. So when we study what people take offense at, how offensive they find it, and how they respond or how they think they should respond, in a way we're studying morality itself, which is not to say we're making moral judgments or establishing what actually is objectively right or wrong, nor are we coming up with an ethical philosophy. We're studying morality as an aspect of human behavior. And defined behaviorally, morality is exactly what people have conflict about and how they handle it. And you'll find, looking across different relationships or societies or segments of society, different moral patterns. And so we use this term moral culture as a broad catch-all to refer to distinct patterns we see of conflict, patterns of what people consider offensive and how they react to it. Now, psychologists, historians, anthropologists have identified a couple of major moral cultures. And the big distinction in this area is between what they call a culture of honor and a culture of dignity. And I'll try to illustrate this with a couple of concrete examples. So, for example, in 1804 in Weehawken, New Jersey, Vice President Aaron Burr and former Secretary of Treasury, former Secretary of Treasury Alexander Hamilton, met and shot pistols at each other, and Hamilton was killed. And the curious thing about this from a modern perspective is they agreed beforehand to meet that morning and shoot at each other, which is a very odd thing cross-culturally speaking. Why did they do this? Well, short version of it is, they had a long history of grievances, but Hamilton had said some bad things about Burr. And Burr got wind of this, and so he wrote Hamilton letters challenging him to either apologize or face him in a duel, as demanded by the code of honor known to all gentlemen of the time. And Hamilton himself, despite saying privately he was morally opposed to dueling, and his own son had been killed in a duel the year before, he agreed to this because he said he thought his reputation would suffer if he didn't, and he wouldn't be able to do any more good in U.S. politics. That's one example. Another example is in 1868 in Richmond, Virginia, a local newspaper published a story about a rich man's daughter, Mary Grant. And the story tells how she, fled off with some guy to get married in secret, which was a scandalous thing to do at the time. And this humiliated the Grant family. It called into question her virtue and their ability to enforce it. And so 3 days later, the newspaper editor who published the story, was shot outside his newspaper office. And police quickly arrested the woman's brother, James Grant. And it looked like an open and shut case. He had been, he was found in a room across the street with the window overlooking where the newspaper editor was shot. He had 4 guns on him, including one that was just recently fired. Witnesses say he rented the room that morning and been sitting there waiting and drinking, waiting to take a shot. Powder burns on his finger, all that kind of stuff. When they let him out of the building, the crowd cheered. 3 cheers for Grant! And when the prosecutors tried to prosecute him, they couldn't find a single juror willing to even consider convicting. As far as the people of Richmond were concerned, what he did was virtuous. He'd done a good thing by defending his family's honor. So what is honor? It's a term that gets used in a lot of different ways and can mean a lot of different things, but when people talk about honor culture, what they're talking about is, first of all, a type of status that is deeply rooted in reputation. Hamilton and Burr, the Grant family, these are people very concerned with their reputation in the eyes of others. And so in honor cultures, reputation is extraordinarily important as a source of moral worth. If other people begin to look down on you, you've lost your honor, you've been dishonored. A second thing has to do with aggression and violence, and physical bravery most of all. In honor cultures, you protect your honor, you defend it by fighting, challenging somebody to a duel, assassinating them even, showing your willingness to be violent and risk consequences. That is what defends your honor. So honor we could define as a kind of moral status that's based around physical bravery and the ability to inflict violence. And it's a kind of moral status based heavily on reputation for these things. And so in honor cultures, you have people being extremely protective of their reputation as their main source of worth and very wary of any slights against their reputation. You also have a moral setting where cowardice takes on an exaggerated importance as a vice and bravery an exaggerated importance as a virtue. Now, probably in every social setting, people value bravery to some extent or another, but it's an exaggerated importance in this kind of places to the point where you might do something that your average middle-class American would consider foolhardy and wasteful, but it'd be considered virtuous because you protected your honor. These cultures, because people are so worried about their reputation for bravery and toughness, tend to cultivate a high sensitivity to slight. Anything people say that slights you, it could be a harsh glare, a careless word. It could be an attack on your character and could be perceived as a potential source of shame. And so you find people willing to go to the mat and have lethal conflicts over things that an outsider might think of as trivial, such as there was a generation-long blood feud that began over 2 people arguing over which star came out first in the evening. Or you'd see fatal duels based on, a newspaper editor says something that's unflattering about another person and they get challenged to a fatal duel. Or, that's another good example, 2 aristocrats in old Europe, their dogs got in a fight and they dueled to the death over that. Or you'd see 2 guys drinking in a bar and one of them would say, "No man can whoop me." The other would say, "I can," and they're going to kill each other over that. These are the kind of things that lead to lethal conflicts in an honor culture. In this culture, tolerating slights is potentially shameful, but so is going to others for help with them, especially appealing to authority figures. Calling the police would be something that would be a source of stigma because it's saying you can't handle it yourself. You can't go out there and be violent and enforce your own honor. It's tantamount to admitting you have no honor. So appeals to third parties and authority figures are also shameful. I gave historical examples here, and judging from those, you could tell honor culture was something more common earlier in history. Up until the 1800s, Western elites were regularly killing each other in duels with pistols and sabers. And in the American South, the strong culture of honor persisted up until after the Civil War. But by the mid-20th century, your average American, or at least your middle-class educated sort, really didn't have a strong sense of honor, which led sociologist Peter Berger to write an article claiming that the concept of honor had become obsolete. Yeah, people still use the word in a kind of vestigial sense to talk about virtue, but no one had a strong sense of honor in the old-time notion. If someone, you tell your average American, you're dishonorable, they'd be like, huh? They weren't going to fly into a rage and challenge you to a fight. They were going to raise their eyebrow and say, okay, crazy pants. So he said the concept of honor had become obsolete and had been replaced by a concept of dignity. Dignity, also a word that can mean a bunch of different things, but one broad meaning is it's a kind of moral worth that all people share, is inherent and unalienable. And because of this universal, inalienable nature, it's a big part of 20th century human rights discourse. The idea is all people have a baseline worth and need to be treated according to it. You also might remember there was like a song in the 80s by Whitney Houston, The Greatest Love, where she said, no matter what they take from me, they can't take away my dignity. It's that idea of it's inalienable. Like, you can't disdignity somebody as you can dishonor them. You treat them badly, it reflects on you, not them. So in a dignity culture, reputation is not so important and not so fragile. Sure, people still care about it, but they're not willing to fight duels over minor accidental slights and to protect their reputation. Indeed, in a dignity culture, you see a generally lower sensitivity to slight. People's stature isn't so bound up in every little potential insult or dirty look or whatever they might receive. And people might even criticize one another for being too sensitive to slight. They might say something like, oh, he's thin-skinned, or she's got a chip on her shoulder. And parents might teach their kids some variant of what, I heard stuff like this when I was a kid. Sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. Or if the kids at school make fun of you, you come home, your parents say, well, they're just doing it to get a rise out of you. Show them you don't care, they'll leave you alone. That's an attitude that would be extraordinarily alien in an honor culture. Which is not to say that in a dignity culture, people are taught to tolerate everything. Certainly things like theft and assault and murder are things that are meant to be taken very seriously. The idea here is there's kind of distinction between minor and verbal or inadvertent slights and material losses and physical violence. And when the latter happens, people are expected to react pretty strongly, but they're not expected to react violently. Not expected to take the law into their own hands. They're expected to call the cops or file a suit or whatever. So there's this notion that it's good to be tolerant and thick-skinned, but also that when things are bad enough, you can then appeal to the authorities without shame. And there's generally a more negative evaluation of violence. So this distinction is important in the sociology of violence for explaining why violent conflict has declined over time, why you get different patterns of violence now than back in the days when US politicians killed each other with pistols. And so my colleague Bradley Campbell and I, we've been teaching about this distinction for years and telling our students, like, look, we've transitioned from this culture of honor to a culture of dignity, and sensitivity to slight has declined. And we started seeing things coming out of the news about modern college campuses that seemed to contradict what we had been teaching. Seemed to suggest that sensitivity to slight had increased again. And one of the main things that caught our eye initially was the increasing popularity of the concept of microaggressions and campaigns to stamp these things out. And microaggressions were said to be small inadvertent slights that caused great harm to minority groups and were a matter of serious oppression that needed to be combated and deserved attention. And we found that kind of strange because, as outsiders, or at least from the view of mainstream culture, some of these things seemed merely rude, like staring at lesbians when they kiss in public. Others seemed like what mainstream culture would say aren't rude at all. Like some of the examples of things given as microaggressions were complimenting someone's shoes, asking someone, where are you from, telling a non-native speaker they speak the language well. One professor was reported for saying she's glad her and her husband both have blue eyes because their baby will have blue eyes. Another person was complained about for using the Spanish word football to describe soccer. And so we found it odd that these things were causing such consternation, And that seemed to, harken back a little bit more to the honor culture of verbal or accidental slights being a serious matter. There's also some other evidence for there being a stronger reaction to this sort of thing. One is that in addition to like people complaining online and posting these things in public, you saw like student protests and mobs of screaming people and demands for people to be fired over stuff like this. Like one of the flaps that got a lot of attention was at Yale, where the administration had sent around some guidelines for students to avoid offensive Halloween costumes. And Erica Christakis, a professor at Yale, sent out an email saying, is this really necessary? Can't the students handle this kind of thing on their own interpersonally through social norms? And her questioning of that was considered so offensive that it led to open protests, demands for her to be fired. And then when her husband, Nicholas, who was also a professor, went out to try to talk to some of the protesting students, they screamed and shouted him down and cursed him and told him he doesn't need to be here and F you and that kind of thing. So fairly severe reactions to these slights. There's also the matter of the way the things were described and framed by the participants. The concept of microaggression takes slights that might be inadvertent and accidental and even well-intentioned, and uses the word aggression, which usually has the connotation of hostility or intentional offenses, and describes them in that way. You have something like Erica Christakis' email being described as a threat to the safety of the community. You have things like words that offend people being described as violence. For example, at Scripps College, when someone wrote Trump 2016 on a surface, it was described by the student government organization as intentional violence against the students. Or at Williams College just this last month, some English students were complaining that the lack of diversity in their English authors they were reading was an act of violence against them. So this reminded us of honor cultures with the sensitivity to slight, this idea that we have strong reactions to these things and view them in very severe terms. But unlike honor culture, people weren't challenging each other to duels. Instead, they were handling their conflicts by relying on third parties. And by third parties, we mean anybody who might be brought into the conflict and made aware of the grievance, whether it's simply gossiping with somebody or appealing to a formal agency of social control like the law. So you see people advertising their grievances on social media and websites, sometimes just to vent, sometimes to try to get together a so-called Twitter mob to harass somebody. You saw public protests and demonstrations in parts of campuses. And you saw complaints to official channels, such as a lot of universities have things like bias response teams or other channels for reporting offensive conduct. And a lot of administrations have been active in policing this kind of behavior, creating things like lists of microaggressions that they circulate to the faculty and advise them don't use these. Or like the Harvard School of Public Health now collects reports of, has your professor used a microaggression in your class on their teaching evaluations? So that resembles the dignity culture in its reliance on third parties, and on settlement by the authorities, but without that ethic of toleration of minor things. So this seemed like a weird thing to us. It didn't quite fit into this dichotomy. And we also saw another aspect of this that we found curious, which was that grievances all tend to be framed, no matter what their apparent origin, in terms of oppression, with the oppressed side being the moral superior. And it struck us as almost the opposite of honor culture, where, if you have an adversary and you want to criticize them, you call them cowardly and weak. Versus on campus culture, if you have an adversary, you want to criticize them, you call them privileged or intimate that they're prejudiced against minorities. And just like being a coward is the worst sin in an honor culture, being prejudiced is the worst sin on campus. So we found that interesting, and we also, if privilege and oppression are the great sins, then those who are marginalized and oppressed, or at the very least innocent of them, maybe also have special wisdom and insight. And we saw a tendency of people to portray themselves and those they were purporting to help by emphasizing their marginality, their fragility, the extent to which they had been victimized or oppressed. Again, almost the opposite of an honor culture where you would say, yeah, hell yeah, I'm privileged, and it was a good thing. Now it's like a sin you have to be told to confess. This emphasis on victimization can be seen in a couple of different angles. It's partly inherent in relying heavily on third parties to manage your conflicts. You have to complain to them that you've been hurt to get them to step in and help you. So you see it in online complaints, and websites that catalog and make lists of microaggressions to try to convince the reader this is a pervasive and serious problem, or in typical strategies of social protest and demonstrations to advertise grievances. You also see it in people emphasizing or exaggerating the extent of their own victimization by phrasing things in the strongest terms possible. Offensive sights and sounds or violence, or they induce trauma or trigger pre-existing trauma. There was a case at Seattle University where some students in the, I think it was the literature program, again, thought the curriculum, the authors weren't diverse enough, but they didn't describe this as a problem, it'd be better to have diversity. They described it as a source of trauma to them that they had to read Western authors. A recent case at Northwestern University, the school newspaper was accused of traumatizing the students by running some photos of former Attorney General Jeff Sessions' talk he gave at the university. In the extreme cases, people might even fabricate victimization whole cloth. These are hate crime hoaxes, which are fairly common on campuses. There's a book out recently I haven't had a chance to read that catalogs several hundred examples of these things. Just for a couple quick examples, in 2004 at Claremont McKenna, there was a guest speaker there to give a talk on racism and anti-Semitism, and she defaced her own car and drew a swastika on it and said, clearly, Claremont McKenna is a hotbed of Nazis and they've oppressed me. At Duke University in 2007, a black student group hung a black baby doll from a noose on campus. Everyone assumed it had been white racist, and there was a big panic over that. And in 2016, and a lot of people were upset over the outcome of the election, there was a big wave of these things on a lot of campuses, such as a young woman in New York, a college student, who said some guys in MAGA hats had assaulted her on a subway and ripped the hijab off her head, and the police consulted the subway security camera footage and it didn't happen, and she admitted it didn't happen. So the central idea we use to try to make sense of this is that victimization or victimhood or marginality is a kind of moral status, in much the same way honor was a moral status in the honor cultures. And just like you have the honor and cowardice dichotomy, now you have a victimhood and privilege dichotomy. So we chose to call this victimhood culture, and that's probably the most controversial and successful thing about the book. Everyone focuses on that term. And I've focused a lot so far on why we use that term and the logic of comparison we're trying to make between these different types of moral system. And really all I've said so far is a matter of description and classification. To me, the most important thing about the work is ironically the thing I'm probably going to talk about the least, which is we propose an explanation for this. We propose a theory of why moral cultures change. And our work here is rooted in the sociology of conflict, and the big idea person in that area is Donald Black, a sociologist who dedicated his life to trying to explain different patterns of conflict and look at how social conditions shape the way people take offense and how they handle it. And drawing from his work and some of our other influences, we propose several conditions we think explain the rise of victimhood culture on college campuses. And I'm not going to have time to get into all of these in detail. I'm just going to run through them. We think the increase of equality and diversity are relevant, partly because they explain the content of modern morality, which is a weird thing in cross-cultural historical perspective. I don't know if there's ever been many other cultures in history that view bigotry as their main sin. We also talk about the increase of weak ties, weak social ties, which emerges both from this long-term trend of social atomization where old tight-knit communities break down, but also from the proliferation of modern social media, which gives everybody this access to hundreds, maybe thousands of potential relationships. I've got Twitter followers. I don't know how half of them are. They're very weak ties. They're such weak relationships, you might not consider them relationships, but if something bad happens to me, I could go make my little post about, oh, this is terrible, and I've advertised it to a bunch of people who know who I am. And a lot of people now have this ability to recruit these distant third parties to act as partisans on their behalf. But of course, to do so, you have to advertise that, yes, I've been victimized, this is a big deal, please help me. You have to convince them to act. And the final factor, I'm going to go into a little bit more detail on this because I had some notion civil liberties might be a more relevant part of this talk, is the rise of authority and stable systems of bureaucratic authority. And the idea here is that where people have access to a higher status third party, such as a boss or an administrator on a college campus, something like that, superiors are often involved in the conflicts of their subordinates. They manage them to some degree or another. And this is very common. It could be the tribal elder, it could be the boss at work, it could be the parents breaking up a fight between two kids. But to some extent, wherever you get extensive systems of authority, you get people turning to them to handle their grievances. And to some extent, this can supplant other mechanisms of handling grievances. Let me just give you the extreme case here to illustrate what I mean. And this is extreme, but totalitarian societies. A lot of people have the view of totalitarianism that it's entirely a top-down thing. The Nazis come marching past the Arc de Triomphe and force everybody to do their bidding. But a lot of it's bottom-up, or at least lateral, another way to put it. The Gestapo, the Stasi in the Soviet Union, there's really not enough of them to keep tabs on people, especially earlier in history where they didn't have the tech that exists now, without the populace largely cooperating by informing on one another. And this is one of the main mechanisms of totalitarianism is the totalitarian state says, please bring us grievances. Please bring us reports. Be on the lookout for here, this kind of behavior, this kind of behavior, this kind of behavior. These are all bad behaviors. Be on the lookout for those. And if someone accuses somebody of one of those behaviors, they respond immediately with little restraint of due process. So to be accused is basically to be, you're in trouble. You're going to be drug off somewhere to be interrogated or worse. And when you have that kind of easy access to the full power of the state, people start to use it against each other fairly enthusiastically sometimes. And it's a mix, right? Sometimes it's people who are kind of true believers in the state ideology. They really, they want to get that counter-revolutionary agitation and get rid of it and, keep the ideals of the revolution going. But a lot of the time, and something historians have found looking over these letters of denunciation, a lot of the time it's just personal stuff. It's just, he gave me a dirty look. He bullied me in high school. I don't like the size of my neighbor's apartment. I'm jealous of it. And you find people denouncing each other over all kinds of matters of interpersonal conflicts, but as long as they phrase their denunciation in terms of the official morality of counter-revolutionary, disloyal to the state, it gets taken seriously, and it's an effective way to make your enemy disappear. And, having a confrontation with somebody is not pleasant. If you can get rid of them with an anonymous complaint and little effort on your part, it's an attractive thing for a lot of people. And even for people who it's not attractive to, they have to face the prisoner's dilemma now of, all right, if I go to the guy and talk to him in an uncomfortable conversation, maybe he'll report me. Better I just report him first. So under that kind of system, other forms of social control, other forms of conflict management tend to wither away. Everything becomes a matter of reporting to the authorities. And even minor things result in major punishments because major punishments are what's easily available. What has this got to do with campus culture? Well, certainly people aren't being shipped off to gulags. It's like comparing a bow and arrow to a howitzer. The principles of aerodynamics might be the same, but the severity is different. One thing we've seen on campuses in the past several decades is a drastic growth in the administration. And I'm away from my own university now, so I can probably get away with this, criticizing the administration. The growth of administrators has outpaced the growth in students and the growth in faculty, and many of these new administrative positions are specifically involved in managing the moral life of the students and the faculty, and handling grievances and in combating offenses. And some of this is what you would call public education. They circulate the lists of approved language and try to heighten people's sensitivity to what might be offensive. And so the intention of this is to educate people on how to avoid giving offense. But of course, when you're doing that, you're also educating people into how to take offense, because here's the things you can be offended by. Here's the official categories we'll respond to quite severely if you accuse somebody of them. You also see the creation of these new organs of formal social control, such as, various offices of diversity and inclusion, whatever else they might do. They often get involved in prosecuting cases or trying to manage when someone's done something offensive or said something offensive. You get things like bias response teams, which often spring into action when there's been an accusation of some kind. The Title IX bureaucracy at a lot of universities. Well, one thing about these that is similar to the totalitarian states is the lack of due process involved. The due process restrictions that the U.S. courts theoretically have, the campus administration doesn't even theoretically have. And oftentimes, there's very little, I'm sure if you're having Kipnis come here and speak, she'll talk about this at length. you can be called into a room and told, okay, here's an accusation against you. And we won't tell you what it is. We won't tell you who said it. And no, you can't talk to a lawyer. No, you can't present evidence. This kind of thing goes on. So wherever you make it very easy and attractive to inform on one another, to have complaints and have them handled by an authority, you get more of that sort of thing. You get a greater appeal to authorities for protection. And because authorities act often to protect people who've been victimized, you get greater emphasis on, well, I've been victimized. You can't just say this person pissed me off. You got to say he traumatized me, and take care of this because I'm in danger. So far I've talked about how institutions shape what we call moral culture, but that's reciprocal, right? Moral behaviors also shape institutions. And this is one thing that's always interested me in social science, is you get these self-reinforcing processes in society. I mean, the most basic one is it takes money to make money, right? Well, to some extent, this kind of institutional or apparatus that encourages sensitivity to slight and dependence on authority, once you have that in place, that can encourage further erosions of due process and further extensive speech codes regulating people's speech, which provide more opportunities for people to take offense and report each other, which provides more demands for safety and more demands for punishing our adversaries. And so moral fervor of all kinds, whether it's religious, ideological, or whatever, could potentially undermine due process and free speech. But I think this is particularly one mechanism where, if left unchecked, and nothing in social life's ever left unchecked, eventually every trend reverses or something intervenes, but could lead to an intensification of this process of moral dependence and moral sensitivity. Questions?
I have some. Let's set up and maybe just have chat a little bit, and then turn it over to the audience. Then we have to put some chairs over there.
Okay.
I'll remind you to turn your gizmo on.
Gizmo.
Yeah. Gizmos are essential.
My mogwai.
You want this chair?
Yeah, sure. Let me sit and pretend to be casual.
Right.
Yeah, I've been teaching for like 15 years now. I'm still nervous in front of groups of people who aren't my normal students.
There we go. All right. Well, I want to start just by saying what a remarkable book I think your book is, primarily because, as you were indicating toward the end there, you guys are interested not just in describing these phenomena that you're describing, that you're interested in talking about, but you offer an explanation or a series of explanations as to why this is happening. So I want to maybe feel that out just a little bit more. Can you say a little bit more about what some of the causes are for this shift? If it is, in fact, is it a broad shift that we're seeing from dignity culture to victimhood culture, or is it something that's more limited to university and college campuses? What's the evidence that it's outside those parameters, that it's spreading more broadly? And then maybe we can get into the weeds a little bit on what some of the broader social and structural forces are that you think that might be leading us in this particular evolutionary direction.
Okay, well, in terms of the spread, when we first started studying this stuff, no one had heard of it.
Yeah.
Like, our first article on this kind of met with lack of interest, and people did talk about it, like, oh, what's this? I never heard of it. What's a microaggression? I never heard of that. And now everyone seems to have. It's in the media now. It's in the news. It's, oh, Lord, I have a whole list of these things that I forget the details of, but there's workshops on this. There's NSF grants to study this. There are cases where, for example, like it was a union contract in Oregon where the union actually negotiated that the management can't microaggress against them, which I thought was a nice little clever thing if you're pro-union to have that in there, because what constitutes a microaggression? They could sue over anything. So this concept itself has definitely spread, and you've seen this multiplication of other similar concepts, like more specific terms for different kinds of verbal offenses. I'm probably manspreading right now. That's one of them. Verbal or visual offenses, mansplaining, manspreading, and cultural appropriation, which was an odd one, especially because, I don't know what that term means. The idea is that, if, like, say, a white person or a Westerner adopts culture from non-whites or non-Westerners, it's a kind of deviance now. The idea is
that was the football example.
Yeah, that they're stealing culture. And so you've seen people like white people criticized for wearing cornrows, for example, which I do think looks better on black folk, but I don't consider it stealing. And so that seemed weird to us because just like 10 years ago, that was a sign you were a good liberal, like that you were interested in other cultures. I'm a cosmopolitan person. I'm going to learn yoga and stuff like this. And we saw people criticized for doing yoga because they were watering it down and bastardizing it with their Western influence. So some of those weird cases, like as a sociologist, I'm interested in how people define things as deviants and how new categories of deviance come into being. And that was a great example of the creation of one. I've drifted off topic here because I found that interesting, but
No, that's fine.
this is sort of thing, this is all part of the discourse now. I mean, Teen Vogue talks about this stuff. Journalists talk about this stuff. Government officials talk about this stuff. I'm pretty sure in Canada it's part of the laws now.
Yeah.
And so it's definitely spread off campus, partly because students eventually move off campus and they get jobs in HR. And they get jobs in the government bureaucracy. They get jobs in the New York Times and stuff like that. So I do think it's something it's still concentrated on campus. And it's still something average Joe Blow would see as a little bit distant from his own moral world. I do think it's spread even since we started studying it, though. And you could always quibble over, these terms we use, dignity culture, victimhood culture, they're just shorthand for comparing different clusters of variations. You can always quibble over how much something is one or the other. I don't like to get into the is it or is it not like binary question. We're looking at variables. But I think it's definitely these variables have gotten more intense and more widespread in American society and other parts of Western society. So that's part of your question, I think. The other part was more about the explanation.
Yeah, what are the causes? What do we know about what's driving this series of changes?
Well, we think the expansion of this ready availability of authorities was the thing I emphasized there. And of course on campus that's the growth of the administration and the administrative bloat that you hear, especially faculty at many places complain about. But in the business world too, you've also got their own kind of bureaucratic bloat. All these departments of, this outgrowth of the HR department. Companies like Google have their own departments of diversity and equity and things of high-minded ideals, but they're partly involved in policing speech, and whenever you have that, you have appeals to authority and tendencies to frame conflicts in certain ways. So that's something that's also happening outside of campus in the private realm of businesses, to some extent in government too, maybe less so in the States right now, but more advanced in Canada and the UK, where they have pretty stringent hate speech laws now. You could be arrested for things you do on YouTube. Right. And so that drives some of the change. We also talk about the role of social media, which seems to be like just gasoline on the fire. You get a lot of acceleration of this stuff in around 2008 or 9. And people have access to this sea of virtual weak partisans. And we say weak partisans because a strong partisan is somebody who really takes up your cause, might be willing to fight and die for you. It's usually not the case. Usually it's like, I'm going to tweet this, retweet. Very minor act of endorsing someone's claim or grievance. But it snowballs. It doesn't always, but you occasionally get these grievances that go viral, and the so-called Twitter mob can sometimes act like an authority figure. It could be, you air your grievance to it and they punish the person for you. Maybe even like getting other authority figures to notice them, like, oh, my employee's got a Twitter mob after him, he's embarrassed my company, fired. That kind of thing happens now too. We also talk about just the factual increase in equality and diversity in America.
This is what I was waiting for you to get to this.
Yeah.
This is the one that I'm really interested in.
Donald Black, whose work we draw from, has a theory of conflict, which you could also call a theory of morality. And the idea is that what people find most offensive is often a deviation from the existing social structure. So in societies with like a ton of hierarchy, like the most egregious offenses, the things people get punished most severely for are challenges to the hierarchy, such as like in the Jim Crow South, talking back to a white person, or in medieval Europe, you had like moral codes that emphasized know your station, know your place. You had laws against peasants trying to make themselves anything more than peasants. You weren't supposed to have social mobility. God ordained this, stay in your place. You get this kind of ethic of hierarchy. In places that have already gotten a high degree of equality, it's like the opposite. There's anthropologists who talk about this in the context of hunter-gatherer societies being relatively egalitarian by civilizational standards. And they police this actively. Anyone acts like he knows better than you tell him to shut up. Anyone starts getting a big head, everyone in the group ridicules him to bring him down.
You better share if you're the one who makes the kill on the hunt.
And
you
if you
better
don't
share
share,
with everyone else, because otherwise
yeah.
you're going to get cut out.
Yeah, exactly. And any sort of, and people like learn to, like, if you make a big kill, you don't even brag about it. You say, I killed nothing today. I'm a crap hunter. I'm a terrible hunter. And that's it's tall poppy syndrome. The poppy that sticks up gets cut down. That's the kind of ethic you get in kind of egalitarian societies that already have a sort of baseline level of equality. They protect it and manage it. So they have like a morality of equality. Vice versa for diversity versus homogeneity. Go to a society that has a single religion, that's like 99%. They do not enshrine religious freedom. Deviations from the common belief are very severe. And for most of society, most of history, societies have been fairly homogenous culturally. You get these multi-ethnic empires, and they have their own kind of live and let live thing. But you look at the local level, go to a medieval village, they're all Catholic. That's what the medieval village does, Right. And heresy's going to get you killed, right? Vice versa, in a place where people are already mixing and you get diversity, you get kind of live and let live ethics, you get positive evaluation of diversity, you get the idea that putting down other cultures of religions is a bad thing, instead of, in most of history, it's been the thing that you do by default. And so that kind of explains the content of the morality and why people are sensitive to specifically the kinds of things they are, like slights against ethnicity, slights against religion, and why they're especially sensitive to slights that would seem to increase hierarchy, like putting down a lower status group, a group that's a minority that has historically been oppressed. That becomes a much, much worse thing.
Mm-hmm. Because these values are important to us, and also, as we were talking about it over dinner a little bit, there's this sense that it's precisely as things are getting better in terms of equality and in terms of freedom and so forth, that's when occasionally you'll see the demands ramping up. I used the example in our discussion at dinner of the American sociologist Nathan Glazer, who died about a year ago. And he was talking in a book about the student radicalism and activism in the 60s. He mentioned, just in passing, he said, it's interesting that it's precisely now, he's talking about 1968 or 1969, said it's precisely now that all the radicals are talking about white racism. He said, in a context in which there's less white racism now in American society than there's ever been before.
Yeah.
And so there's a similar kind of sense I had as I was reading your book and that analysis, using that black concept.
You could do like the Ngram search of how many books mention white supremacy.
Right.
And as we get farther from the actual Jim Crow period, that keeps getting more and more frequent.
Quite counterintuitive and fascinating. I have one more question, then I'll turn it over and see if we have some questions from the audience. I wonder if you might reflect a little bit on, so you're talking about how moral cultures are changing, how there are different ways of evaluating honor or dignity and moral value and the way that we determine who's a good character and who's a bad character. Could you say a little bit, you guys talk a little bit about this in the book, talk a little bit more about how conceptions of the individual, conceptions of the subject in the way that we talk about it in sociology, how does the idea of the subject change in these different cultures? That is one of the things that really stuck out to me in the book. It sticks out to me every time I look at this phenomenon, but in the way that you guys talk about it in the book, it's really clear. So the subject starts in honor culture as in some ways, it's a really resilient subject. I mean, I'm tough enough and I'm assertive enough and I'm independent enough that I'm going to stand up for my own honor. If somebody dishonors me, it's my responsibility to go out and deal with that, to put that, straighten them out. The language that Elijah Anderson uses, and you quote him talking about the culture of the streets. Yeah, in dignity culture too, there's the self is, but in honor culture, it's resilient in honor culture, but there's also a sense that it's a little vulnerable too to mere words. You say words to me, and that can harm me in some sense. So in honor culture, the subject's kind of both resilient and vulnerable. In dignity culture, the subject seems more resilient. Sticks and stones may break my bones, words will never hurt me. Now in victimhood culture, we've gotten a more or less purely vulnerable subject. There's no resiliency in the subject now. The subject is vulnerable to virtually everything. This is, as you were talking about some of the examples, I was remarking on one of them that I read just in the news today. Some sports commentator was fired apparently, or at least suspended briefly, because in commenting on a football game, he noted that an African-American quarterback was really good at doing ball fakes because the dark ball blended in with the dark skin of his arm and the home jersey of the team's uniform. He just said, I mean, that's not a pejorative remark. He's saying this is a good thing. He's really good at doing this thing that's successful for his team. And they fired him for the remark because he made some remark which is seen as beyond the pale because of, again, subjects are so vulnerable. They're so unresilient in the face of that. Then inevitably that remark is going to recall racist memories, or it's going to otherwise traumatize folks. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more. I mean, that's my sense, at least, that it seems like the subject has gotten progressively less and less and less resilient over time from these, as we transition between these different moral cultures. Does that ring right to you?
I don't know if it's a linear trend, right? But we don't really focus on resilience per se, other than when we tap into, we do cite Lukyanov and Haidt's stuff.
Yeah.
And if you don't know, Greg Lukyanov, free speech advocate, and Jonathan Haidt, a social psychologist, they wrote a book, The Coddling of the American Mind.
Right.
And they look at this, some of these phenomena from a like therapeutic perspective, cognitive behavioral therapy, and also mindfulness meditation and things like that, and say, sensitivity to slight can actually be damaging for the person who's taking offense. Because when you see a social world full of offenses and things, oh, this is oppressing me, that's oppressing me, it's not good mentally to constantly be angered, and also to constantly be viewing yourself as unable to respond to these things, that they're threatening. They say that counteracts resilience. So I'm aware of that argument. Yeah. I'm not sure how I'd think about that in terms of the honor culture, because they have that sensitivity too, and they feel that their worth is bound up in things to an outsider might seem very slight.
Yeah, they're more complicated in some ways, it seems, than either of the other two cultures when it comes to that.
Well, Mark Cooney characterizes, he's got a book out on honor killings, which I recommend reading. It's a whole other thing. Collective family honor in the Middle East is slightly different than the individual honor you got among Southern gentlemen. But he characterizes honor cultures as a kind of fragile and competitive equality. Like, theoretically, honor emerges around people who are kind of the same station. Like, gentlemen dueled with gentlemen. They didn't duel with their own slaves or what have you. Right. But it's a very fragile equality. At any minute, someone might get one up on you and you're cast down. And so, yeah, they have a means of defending themselves and fighting back, but they seem to just live in constant wariness. And reading some of the stuff from, I've used all these old history examples. There's still honor cultures in America now. It's the code of the streets. Urban ethnographer Elijah Anderson calls it the culture of the violent ghetto. In my neighborhood, words that get you killed. Step on someone's shoes and don't apologize. You're dissing him. He's going to fight you for it. And you read some of the interviews with people who live in that, and by the time they're old, by old I mean like 25, which is old in a neighborhood with high levels of violence, and they're tired of it. Like, they're very exhausted of always having that hardcore stare when they walk down the street. So I don't know if this answered your question at all, but
no, it's very good. It's good. Let's open it up to see if there are any questions from the audience, and I'll run out to you with a mic.
Hi, thank you for coming tonight. So I'm just trying to understand the argument and make sure I have the premise correct. So you're talking about honor cultures, dignity cultures, and then more recently victimhood cultures. Is that rooted in a chronology, or is it sort of just that they rise and fall over time in different ways?
It's that they vary with the social conditions. Specifically, there's a concept we have called the social structure of the conflict, meaning like when a grievance happens, like what are the relationships involved between the aggrieved, the offender, and any third parties that might be drawn into it. And so the idea in this area of sociology is you try to explain which sort of social structures are conducive to what types of grievances and ways of handling them. And so we try to explain differences in moral cultures with things like the presence of authoritative third parties, the presence of weak ties between people, and the overall levels of equality and diversity between the people in the social setting. And so we have a theory that, remember these terms are just like catch-all terms for little clusters of variables, like victimhood culture, high sensitivity to slight, high dependence on authorities to handle conflict. When do you get those two things in combination? We think it's with the four conditions we specify, versus when do you get high sensitivity to slight, but also a tendency to handle conflicts through violence. It's a different set of conditions. So I'm not doing it justice, but it's also the chapter that people tend to stop reading on. For good or for ill, right? People think there's this magic thing about words. And so you label something a certain way, and like people either like, oh yeah, that's great. The sociologist discovered we live in a victimhood culture, and they can say that. And I'm like, oh, I didn't discover it. It's just a term to try to capture this variable. Or like vice versa, like, oh, you're saying these people are victims. You're just some conservative asshole. You get that too. But that's really not our argument. Our argument is that there's a set of structural conditions that increase these variable aspects of conflict. Sensitivity to slight, concern with equality, concern with diversity, tendency to frame conflicts in terms of oppression, and tendency to complain to third parties.
Other questions?
I don't know that I need that, but
Yeah, I'll let you have it anyway.
thanks again for coming. But the victimhood culture, is there a way to reverse that? Or is there a chance it can't be reversed? And if so, how do you do that?
That's a good question, and we talk about this a little bit towards the end of the book. And I'm one of those sociologists. I've always shied away from any sort of policy thing. I don't know how to run my own life, let alone a society. But logically, you would reverse it by reversing the trends we say are responsible for it. The thing is, some of those trends are things we think are good in themselves. I'm for more equality, and I'm fine with diversity. I'm married an immigrant, so. I have a personal liking of those things, and I don't want to go back to strict hierarchies and so forth. So I usually tend to focus on the aspects of this, the things you might get some broad consensus about rolling back. Getting broad consensus on anything's hard. But for example, I emphasize the administrative bloat for that reason. That's something a lot of people complain about for various reasons. You might get some consensus on rolling that back, trimming that. How do you do it exactly? What are the mechanics involved? I don't know. Read some books on political organizing maybe. It's actually my next project. I'm kind of interested in studying that stuff. Right now, I don't claim any expertise in social engineering or political activism or what have you, but that would be one angle to take. Another angle I sometimes suggest, which is a little bit unsociological, but heal thyself. Don't participate in the culture of offense and outrage, whether your thing is religion or meditation or just go read Marcus Aurelius or whatever, Stoicism. Just try to learn to charitably interpret what other people say and try to be kind and understanding in face of disagreements. I don't know if that will have any sort of aggregate effect, but personally, I am in favor of it.
The reason I ask is like we seem to be marching down this road to less and less free speech.
Yeah.
And that's kind of getting scary.
Yeah.
And whatever you say is, if somebody doesn't like it, then it's hate speech. And it's like, no, it isn't, not necessarily. So that's why I ask, is there a way that can be reversed other than going to the courts and having the court say, no, you're allowed to say that?
Right.
I mean, that's unwieldy.
It's partly also a matter of how do you, so one of the things we talk about is like social atomization and the breakdown of those kind of face-to-face ties that might have encouraged people to talk about things rather than, okay, I'm just going to be quiet and go complain on social media or to the authorities, or that would allow for that sort of informal peacemaking you get when there's a lot of overlapping social ties and, person A offends person B. Person C knows them both, and not an authority figure per se, maybe just a respected person, and they step in and say, look, guys, I can help you sort this out. That stuff, there's been a long linear trend of social atomization. Robert Putnam, Bowling Alone kind of things documented that. How do you reverse that? Can you? What would the side effects be? I don't know. And, I don't want to, glorify, a golden age that never was. There's dark sides to community as well, dark sides to solidarity, and problems with every sort of moral culture. But I'm from a dignity culture, and I like the free speech. I like the due process. I'm concerned with maintaining those things, personally, is my opinion. And so, I am concerned about how to do that. But I said I'm not a social engineer. I just have these ideas I throw out, and I hope smarter people than me see some way to do this.
More questions?
I just want to get a sense of what you think this means pedagogically. So I follow you on Twitter, so if you ever need someone to join a mob, I'll be...
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
Let's
but you retweeted
get someone fired, not me.
You retweeted an example the other day of a professor somewhere, I forget where, getting reprimanded for showing how bad survey design can lead someone to
Oy vey.
think the Holocaust wasn't real. And that was kind of weird because I use that example in every intro class.
Yeah, yeah.
And so I mean, that's, you can talk about that if you want, but I'm wondering if you think that sort of the Overton window for what ideas can be discussed and debated is closing, or if this is just sort of, a handful of people and we're sort of, we're talking about the extreme cases and not talking about the vast majority of students and the vast majority of faculty.
I don't think we're talking about the vast majority. The problem is it's not necessarily the vast majority that steers where cultures and institutions go. I mean, you go to one of these honor cultures, the vast majority of people aren't violent. They just have to put on that brave face because those people who are violent run things. That's the people who have the status in their community and are most loud and vocal and aggressively prosecuting conflicts and determining the tone of public spaces. And so you have this tendency of very vocal and organized and aggressive people to kind of push the culture of a group in a certain direction or another. So yeah, I don't think it's the majority per se, but I do think there's you said closing of the Overton window, maybe, but even weirder than that, it's a kind of a randomness to it all. Like, I never would have, this is not, using that, if you're not familiar with the example he's using, I do this in research methods all the time when I talk about survey methods. There's a really cool example of how you'll get really different results if you word a survey differently. It was a survey in 1992 by a Jewish organization about Holocaust denial, and they worded the question one way, it had a confusing double negative in it, and that apparently trips up people's reading when they're trying to figure out how to answer. And so you had a ridiculously high proportion of respondents say they thought it was possible the Holocaust never happened, 25% of Americans. It's that can't be right. I mean, I know there's crazy beliefs out there, but 25%, that seems really high. And so they redid it a year later. They did the question differently so it wasn't as confusing, and it dropped down to 2%. All right, cool. Now we're in the range of the lizard man constant. 2% of people believe in pretty much anything. Lizard people run the government or whatever. You can find 2% who are on board with it. That made a lot more sense. Great example of survey methods and how to check your work and all that kind of stuff. And so some professor got reported to the administration. This was an offensive example to use, that he was questioning the Holocaust by using this example. And I don't think that's a widespread belief that that's offensive. I don't think that's even among activist circles, I don't think that was a standing thing you weren't allowed to talk about. I just think that one person took offense for whatever reason. Maybe they had a personal grudge, which is often the case when people report you for this, that, or the other. But the point is it worked. And now it joins the list of things I got to worry about when I teach. Could someone use that against me? So it's not so much that there's this clear-cut window of things you can say and can't say. It's an environment where you never know what they'll nail you on. There's a sort of randomness to it. I've known people who say things I find offensive in their classes, and they get away with it. It's okay, cool, they got guts. But you never know when the eye of Sauron's going to land on you. And this, oh no, now I'm at the center of the Twitter mob. So there's a sort of randomness that gives it the weird quality of how much risk are you willing to take, what are you willing to say, and do I even understand what I can safely say? Because the Overton window would imply I understand that I have a range of things. I'm not sure I understand that. I don't know what'll set people off.
Other questions?
Thanks. Thanks for the talk. It was real good. I was just curious about whether you have ever come across any incidents where the diversity machinery in higher education has responded actively to a claim that someone has been victimized because of their traditional religious beliefs, specifically somebody who's Christian, for example, because there are situations I'm familiar with where one diversity administrator reportedly made a comment about how Christian family values are white supremacist, for example, or there are those sorts of biased comments, oh, we shouldn't employ Christians here and so forth, that one faculty member made once. And those kinds of comments I hear fairly often. So, again, I'm not advocating kind of totalitarian victimization culture in that direction. But I'm just curious about whether this is applied equally, or if there are some groups that are more equal than others in terms of this being applied, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's one reason we still defend using that term, victimhood culture, despite all the controversy, is that other people have suggested alternatives like empathy cultures. It's just a culture where we're very empathetic and sensitive to people's suffering, but some people, not others. If you belong to a group that gets labeled dominant or oppressor or privileged, no, who cares? You had a former New York Times editor was like tweeting stuff about, white people just need to die, that kind of thing. You had a professor who, when that UVA student was killed by the North Korean government, it's like, hey, he got what he deserved. He's just like the clueless white privileged frat boys I teach. That's acceptable. There was a school where they had a big sign at an event saying no crackers. And someone was like, well, isn't that offensive to poor whites or southern whites? They're like, yeah, we don't like crackers, it's fine. And we just mean, they're all bigots, we mean bigots, that kind of thing. So there's a sense in which, some groups, it's open season, you can offend them, it's even admirable, you're punching up, hashtag white genocide. That's actually something sociology professors have tweeted out. They mean specifically like erasing the culture, not murdering the people, but it's kind of hard, easy to miss that distinction if you're seeing that on Twitter. So yeah, it's definitely a sort of Manichaean look where there's oppressors and oppressed, and the former, the oppressors, they don't deserve sympathy, empathy, or whatever. The oppressed, they can do no wrong. We actually see professors like defining terms like racism and sexism so that whites by definition can't be victims of racism, and non-whites by definition can't commit racism. So it's like, yeah, we're very concerned of combating racism, but we've defined it so that only some groups can be subject to it, others can't be, so open season if you want to. Which is one sort of thing where this departs from dignity culture, because in some way dignity culture overlaps with this, like this norm of not offending people. Dignity culture says don't go out of your way to give offense. It's part of not taking offense is not giving offense. But there's this idea that you treat everybody equally, because all have equal moral worth. I don't see that in those sorts of flaps. And as to your original question, has anybody ever been reported to the machinery, or has they ever done anything for a slight against a Christian or a Mormon or whatever? There's probably been some case somewhere, maybe, but I don't see them in my perusal of the things that make the news.
Other questions?
So yeah, you mentioned some of the conditions that you thought lead to victimhood culture. You mentioned one being this idea of that we move from a hierarchical society to this more egalitarian society, and how the principles of diversity and equality are very important nowadays. And I think you said something like, yeah, now we really want to defend them and get it all the way and stay there, so people are very defensive of those ideas, which I think in principle sound great, right? Like diversity, equality, those two terms by their definition, I'd say they're things I would strongly agree with. Let's put it that way, that as good things. But on the other hand, when you see how this works in practice, it does, at least to me, it doesn't seem that there's a strong interest in keeping things that way. There seems to be a very narrow definition of what terms like diversity and equality mean, and it seems to get much narrower all the time, almost as if creating some sort of opposite hierarchy as opposed to trying to defend equality as a whole. So that's, I don't know, is that something you think it's true? Also, I'll do both of them at the same time. Also, you mentioned that there's this appeal to authority, which is, I think, also true. But so how much authority do you feel the authorities have? Because sometimes it feels like, there's an appeal for authority to do things, but it also feels sometimes that authority in many ways feels forced to comply. In many ways it doesn't seem like it's the authorities deciding, this is wrong, therefore I'll squish it immediately. But sometimes feel like, things just spiral out of control, and some random administrator somewhere feels like, I must do something about this, otherwise I will get in trouble soon. So how much do you think authority really has authority? Or more they're called like, you should do this for us, and
kind of I guess a victim in themselves, just of having to comply with, what the majority thinks in certain places. Yeah.
Those are all very good questions. Regarding the first two, we think that the historical increase of equality between diverse groups, and again, relative to other times and places in history, does result in the basic ethic of, bigotry bad, which is sort of the core ethic behind a lot of the stuff, oppression bad, bigotry bad. But you're right, there could be a kind of paradoxical thing here where if you start apportioning status based on are you the privileged group or the minority group or the oppressed group, and okay, if you're a privileged group, screw you, you start creating a kind of moral hierarchy. And it might be opposite to other kinds of hierarchy. It might still be the privileged group is privileged in terms of wealth and other things like that. But you're creating a kind of moral hierarchy that is a source of is in itself a source of inequality, and it might not counteract or overshadow other sources of inequality. It might be something that exists alongside them, but you can have moral hierarchy coming out of an ideology or a moral system that was birthed by equality. And as to diversity, one point we make in the book is there's different dimensions of diversity, right? So if the theory is that pre-existing diversity creates an ethic of tolerating diversity, and pre-existing homogeneity is conducive to an ethic of they don't pollute what we have here, you might expect that to vary across different dimensions of culture. Like if you have a place with like a ton of ethnic diversity, but they're all religiously homogenous, you wouldn't expect them necessarily to be super on board with, increasing their religious diversity. Compare that to, say, the campus, the faculty and the administration, politically completely homogenous. I mean, not completely, but it's like really lopsided, right? You're more likely to find a Marxist and a conservative on university faculties, or at least among sociologists. So you wouldn't expect a ton of, oh yeah, rah, let's bring in some diverse political viewpoints there. You'd expect more like shock that, oh wait, people disagree with me? Everyone I know agrees with me. Everyone I've ever been around has the same beliefs as me. Versus you might have like a lot of support for demographic diversity and things like that. Does that sort of answer that part? Okay. I'm going to get home tonight and sit there not sleeping in my hotel room and be like, I had a better answer I should have given. I hate these things for this reason, because I'm always like, oh, that was a good question. I didn't answer it fully. I should have mentioned this and that. And the other thing you mentioned is something that I'm kind of puzzled by, to be honest. The extent to which administrators often seem to go along with stuff, even if maybe they're not true believers themselves. They kind of feel like, oh, pressured, there's people outside my door. Maybe some of it's just the extent to which, the main thing in administration wants to make a problem shut up, So you make enough fuss, they don't want to look bad, we're getting bad press, and then they try to take whatever action will shut up the conflict. But in some cases, it seems like their actions, backfire and lead to problems for the university. Like I'm thinking of the Evergreen University case, where the president there really seemed to side with the students who basically chased a professor off campus, and he wound up, suing the university successfully for over $1 million for a hostile work environment. And that guy never seemed to have learned a lesson from it. So maybe he's just a true believer and is involved in it in that way and really thinks he's doing God's work, or maybe he's just coward.
Other questions?
So you mentioned at a few points, like different examples, sort of qualitative evidence of times where white people have been sort of piled on by students or mobs on Twitter for in this victim culture that you mentioned. Do you have, I guess, quantitative evidence about how widespread or not this issue is? Just in terms of like, I know there's thousands of colleges and universities in the U.S., and some of your examples are from years ago. One was 2007. So, like, how pervasive is this or not?
I'm going to be a wuss here and claim theorist. I don't have like a quantitative methodology. Our method is just poring over for the couple of years we were focused on this, we poured over news examples, did Google searches on terms like microaggression, trauma trigger warning, stuff like that. I am aware vaguely of a couple people who've done more quantitative things, like there's a data set analyzing speaker disinvitations, and I think they had like a sample of 70 or 90, something like that happened in a period of a couple years. And
Is that the one on the Heterodox Academy site that you're
yeah,
referring to?
Heterodox
John
did that
Haidt.
one. To get to the spirit of your question, this is the first time I've been asked a question I've been waiting for 2 years, which is about methodology. Usually people just want to quibble over terminology. And what I really would like to start discussing more, or see more people discussing on their own, is measurement. Okay, we've tried to define these things as clearly as we can in terms of dimensions of continuum of variation, and here's a theoretical concept, here's 4 or 5 examples to orient you to what we mean by it. I would like to see more researchers trying to test these propositions, these hypotheses. I don't have a lot of quantitative research. I call for it. I welcome it. And then, you know what? Some of my ideas are going to be wrong probably, but go ahead, I endorse it. I'm not a good nuts and bolts quantitative researcher, though I suck at it.
Other questions? Last call? Well, if I might, real quickly, just before we adjourn for the evening, I'm going to, first of all, correct I misspoke as I anticipated I would about the events that are coming up. And in fact, I didn't even try the dates, but I got them in the wrong order. I'm now looking at the bpalc.blogs.bucknell.edu site so I can get these accurately communicated to you. The next talk is, in fact, Laura Kipnis in this series. That's taking place Thursday, March 19th. Location to be determined still, but we've got a pretty good set of ideas as to where that might take place. And the title of her talk will be Unwanted Advances, Sexual Paranoia Comes to Campus. Again, that's March 19th, 2020, 7 p.m. at a place to be determined. And then Peter Bogosian, who's the professor of philosophy at Portland State University, working on grievance studies, as I mentioned at the outset. His talk will be on Monday, April 6th at 7 p.m., also location yet to be determined. So that's the remainder of the talks in this series. And again, there's a whole collection of talks still to happen in the other series that I mentioned. Those will all be taking place. I think the first one of those is in January of next year, which is, in fact, I could look real quickly because I've got the website here. I believe that's the one where our former Bucknell colleague, Jen Silva from my department, Sociology and Anthropology, is coming back to join us to talk a little bit about her research. Yes, I'm right. It's Wednesday, January 22nd. Jen Silva will be back. She's now at the Indiana University School of Public and Environmental Affairs. She's going to give us a talk on class, politics, and American identity in flyover America. She did a bunch of research out in Mount Carmel, not that far from here, over the last couple of years, and just published a book titled We're Still Here, Pain and Politics in the Heart of America, based on that research. So that's the next talk in that series. The one final thing then, since Jason, you mentioned John Haidt and this work that he's done now with Greg Lukianoff on they're talking about a whole range of this stuff, but they're specifically interested, I think, in a good chunk of that book in the ramifications of victimization culture for the life of universities. If you're interested in following up on that and you don't have quite the energy to go read the entirety of Haidt and Lukianoff's book, I would highly recommend that you go up on YouTube, just plug into YouTube the search engine there, his last name, Haidt, H-A-I-D-T, and Coddle University, C-O-D-D-L-E University. He does this whole bit where it's about a 25-minute presentation where he just presents 2 models of the university, one of which he's being semi-satirical in doing this, but it's also loaded with information. One of these models of university he calls Coddle University, Coddle U. That's the victimization culture university. And the other one he calls Strengthen University, Strengthen U. That's if you will, I guess the dignity culture version of a university. Very informative, very entertaining. I think whatever your position is on that, you'll come away having learned something from it. So that's it for tonight. Thank you again very much for coming. No, last call for questions, no more? The URL again is bpalc.blogs, B-L-O-G-S, .bucknell, B-U-C-K-N-E-L-L, .edu. I think I might have done .com earlier or something stupidly enough. No, did I did edu? Good. BPALC blogs, Bucknell, edu. So tons and tons of info there. And in fact, we will have the video of this event up as soon as we can get it produced and ready to go. So again, thanks very much for coming. Enjoy the holiday season. It's not too cold out there. At least it wasn't too cold when we came in tonight. So I won't give you my usual send-off is bundle up out there and be prepared. You don't have to quite do that as much tonight, but it'll get colder soon enough. Thanks again, and have a good evening. We'll see some of you at the next event we hope.